The metallic click of the lock was a sound that would etch itself into Emma Carter's bones, a final, chilling period at the end of a sentence she hadn't known she was living. One moment, she was standing in the damp, unfinished basement of the house she called a home. The next, she was plunged into a suffocating silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The heavy door sealed shut, plunging the windowless room into a gloom broken only by the weak, buzzing glow of a single bare bulb. Her husband Daniel's words, uttered with a terrifying, reasoned calm, still hung in the cold air. "Find my money or rot in there forever. You're not my wife. You're a thief." For a missing $100, a sum he knew was never taken, he had sentenced her to a tomb of concrete and dust. Her frantic pounding on the unyielding wood was met with a retreating silence, the echo of his polished shoes on the stairs fading away, leaving her utterly alone. This was not a fit of rage, it was a calculated erasure. As she slid down the door, the rough grain scraping her back, the horrifying truth dawned. The accusation was never about the money. It was the flimsy, perfect pretext he needed to make her disappear, to vanish the quiet, inconvenient wife who no longer fit into the pristine narrative of his controlled, respectable life. The darkness around her wasn't just absence of light. It was the void of a future stolen. And in that crushing solitude, a desperate, primal question took root. How does one survive when they have already been buried alive? Days in the cellar bled into a formless, agonizing stretch of time, measured only by the twice-daily appearance of a tray of bland food slid through a narrow slot, and the occasional humiliating escorted trip to a bathroom upstairs under Daniel's cold, watchful eye. The world above continued without her. She heard its ghostly echoes, the muffled cadence of Daniel's business calls, the sharp click of her mother-in-law Margaret's disapproving heels, and, most painfully, the new sound of a woman's laughter, light, confident, and utterly at home in what had once been her dining room. Emma learned the name Lydia without ever seeing her face, the sound of it drifting down the stairs like a knife twist. Daniel had not just imprisoned her, he was meticulously rewriting their history, painting her as unstable, a wife who had fled, a nervous breakdown made flesh. He was thriving in her absence, his life expanding as hers contracted to the 4 concrete walls that held her. Hunger became a constant companion, sharpening her senses and hollowing out her cheeks. Fear was the damp air she breathed. She marked the passage of weeks with faint scratches on the wall, a feeble testament to an existence that was being systematically negated. Her reflection in the sliver of mirror during her supervised showers showed a ghost, a woman whose eyes had grown old with a knowledge she wished she could forget. Hope felt like a dangerous indulgence, a flame too easily snuffed by the crushing reality of the lock on the door. The first spark of that forbidden hope came not with a shout, but with a crust of bread. One evening, as Emma listlessly pushed her meager meal around the tray, her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Tucked beneath the bowl was an extra piece of bread, dry and hard, but undeniably surplus. Her heart stuttered, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. It could be a mistake, a cruel oversight, but the next day there was a thicker portion of soup. The day after that, a small, perfect apple, its skin cool and smooth against her palm, hidden in a fold of the napkin. This was no accident. This was a message, crafted in the only currency available, sustenance. Someone in the house was seeing her, defying Daniel, and choosing, in the smallest and most dangerous way possible, to keep her alive. The only possible answer was Clara, the quiet, older housekeeper who moved through the house like a shadow, her eyes downcast but missing nothing. Emma remembered the fleeting, warm smiles they had exchanged in another life, a secret solidarity in the polished, cold atmosphere Daniel and Margaret cultivated. A silent, desperate dialogue began. Emma started arranging her empty tray in deliberate patterns, the spoon placed to the left, the bowl overturned, and the napkin folded into a tiny, precise square. It was a language of crumbs and patience, and Clara answered. A scratch on the edge of the returned tray, a sprig of parsley where there was never green, a boiled egg still warm. Each was a whisper. I see you. I am here. You are not forgotten. This clandestine connection became Emma's lifeline, a thread of sanity in the abyss. Clara began to risk more. During the deepest hours of the night, when the house above was silent and Daniel slept, the lock would click with a softer, more careful sound. Clara would slip in, a spectral figure in the gloom, bringing not just extra food, but water, a clean blanket, and once a pair of soft-soled shoes. Not yet, Clara breathed the first time Emma looked at the shoes with desperate confusion. I know, Emma whispered back, her voice raspy from disuse. They established rules born of terror and necessity. Emma never stood near the door during the day where her shadow might be seen. She never spoke unless Clara spoke first, and if anything felt wrong, Clara would vanish without a word. Through these furtive visits, Emma learned the terrifying scope of her situation. I've seen this before, Clara confessed one night, her voice cracking with a grief that was decades old. My sister, her husband did this, told everyone she was sick, unstable. She didn't make it out. The words settled in Emma's soul like stones. This was not a unique madness. It was a pattern, a pathology of control that ended in unmarked graves and silenced obituaries. I won't let it happen again, Clara vowed, her eyes fierce in the dim light. Not if I can help it. That vow shifted everything. Survival was no longer the only goal. It was the prerequisite for justice. Clara began to orchestrate Emma's cautious, temporary releases from the basement. Guided by Clara's iron grip, Emma would creep up the stairs on trembling legs, her muscles atrophied from confinement, to steal precious minutes in a back hallway, to drink cool water slowly in the laundry room, to stare at her own gaunt, unfamiliar reflection in a bathroom mirror. These excursions were not toward freedom, but deeper into the heart of the enemy's territory, a necessary reconnaissance to reclaim her own mind and learn the rhythms of the house from a place of hidden agency. She learned Daniel drank more heavily now, his confidence morphing into carelessness. She learned the exact pattern of his footsteps when he was anxious, the way he left his study door ajar when on certain phone calls. She became a ghost, haunting her own home, gathering intelligence in the shadows. Meanwhile, Clara's work extended beyond the property line. She made contact, through layers of caution, with an advocacy network, people who understood coercive control, financial abuse, and the way predators like Daniel operated in the blind spots of the law. Clara brought news in hushed, thrilling increments. A private investigator was now quietly looking into Daniel's business affairs. A financial crimes task force had noticed irregularities in his complex web of accounts. He did this to himself, Clara whispered one night, her face alight with a grim satisfaction. He's greedy. He hides money, but he brags. He leaves trails. The plan that coalesced was audacious in its patience. Emma would not simply escape. An escapee could be hunted, discredited as the unstable wife Daniel had portrayed. Instead, she would remain legally, strategically missing. While Daniel believed himself secure, believing his victim broken and contained, the noose would tighten around him. With Clara as her sole link to the outside world, Emma began to construct a legal case from her prison. Clara smuggled in documents, affidavits, timelines, financial disclosures. Emma signed them with a hand that grew steadier each time, her name on paper, a powerful act of rebellion. She recorded everything she knew, dates, account numbers she'd overheard, the names of Daniel's associates, the structure of his lies. She became a confidential informant, her prison cell, her command center. The investigators never came to the house. Emma existed for them as a file, a voice on a secured recording, a signature on a document. Her silence was her weapon. Daniel, emboldened by his own perceived victory and distracted by his burgeoning legal troubles and his new life with Lydia, grew sloppy.
One night, after returning Emma to the basement, he simply forgot to turn the lock fully. Emma and Clara stared at the unsecured door, a universe of possibility yawning before them. The power dynamic had imperceptibly shifted. The cage was now optional. "Lock it," Emma whispered, the words tasting of iron and resolve. She chose to stay, not out of fear, but out of strategy. The basement was no longer her prison. It was her fortress, her observation post from which she would watch her husband's empire crumble. The downfall, when it came, was not a single explosion, but a systematic implosion. Warrants were executed, not at the home first, but at the offices of Daniel's business partners. Accounts were frozen, assets seized. The respectable facade he had spent a lifetime polishing cracked under the pressure of subpoenas and federal investigators. Emma listened from her hidden perch as the house above descended into chaos, the shouting phone calls, the slammed doors, Margaret's shrill, panicked voice, the absence of Lydia's laughter. The knock on the front door was firm, final, and unmistakably official. Emma did not witness the moment Daniel's world ended, but she heard it. The heavy tread of many feet, the curt, professional voices, the stunned silence that followed. On that morning, before dawn, Clara had finally spirited her out for the last time, not to freedom, but to a safe house where she could watch the reckoning unfold from a distance. Daniel's arrest made headlines, but the stories focused on fraud, embezzlement, and financial crimes. The shadow of his imprisoned wife was a detail only hinted at, a mystery that made the scandal all the more gothic. The legal machinery she had helped set in motion worked with cold efficiency. Emergency court orders transferred assets, recognizing Emma as both victim and beneficiary. The money Daniel had hidden, the money he had accused her of stealing a pittance of, now flowed back to her, not as a gift, but as restitution. He was literally funding his own destruction. In the stark, quiet room of the county jail, Daniel finally faced the ghost he had created. He looked diminished, the arrogance drained from him, leaving a bewildered husk. "You were there," he stammered, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific comprehension. "All that time." Emma sat across from him, calm, composed, wearing the simple, elegant clothes her new wealth afforded. She was no longer the pale, trembling woman from the basement. She was a force, serene and unassailable. "Yes," she said, her voice even. "You never left," he breathed, the magnitude of his miscalculation finally crashing down. "You let me believe you were gone." Emma offered a small, cold smile. "You told everyone I was." He stared, the master of control realizing he had never been in control at all. "You ruined me," he spat, a last feeble attempt at accusation. Emma leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "You did that yourself. I just kept the records." As she stood to leave, his final plaintive question followed her the door. Not looking back, her answer the final truth that would haunt him every remaining day. "Because you would have won, and I didn't survive just to let that happen." She walked into the blinding sunlight not as a victim seeking solace, but as a victor claiming a world that was now irrevocably her own. The money was substantial, a fortune reclaimed from shadows, but it was the silence that followed, the deep, profound silence of a lock that would never click again, that felt like the truest wealth. Emma Carter, once erased, was now permanent. She moved through the world unseen by those who did not need to see her, her freedom absolute, her future a vast, uncharted territory she would explore on her own terms, her spirit forged and tempered in the dark, unbreakable. The world beyond the safe house was a symphony of ordinary noise that, for weeks, felt overwhelmingly loud. The rumble of buses, the shriek of children at a nearby park, the constant electronic hum of a city alive. These were sounds Emma had to relearn.
They were not threats, but the music of a life reclaimed. The small apartment Clara had secured was anonymous, beige, and blessedly full of windows. Emma would sit for hours, a blanket around her shoulders, watching the play of light across the floor, tracing its journey from dawn's weak gold to the deep orange of dusk. She was free, but freedom, she quickly discovered, was not a destination. It was a muscle that had atrophied, and exercising it was exhausting, painful work. Sleep was fractured, haunted by the echo of the lock and the feel of concrete under her fingertips. She would wake gasping, convinced the walls were closing in, only to have to consciously talk herself down, touching the painted drywall, the flimsy curtains, reminding herself, this opens. You can leave. Clara became her anchor in this new, disorienting sea. She has left Daniel's employment the day after Emma's extraction, her role as a witness making her position untenable. The advocacy network had provided her with protection, and now a modest stipend that allowed her to stay close. They never spoke of gratitude. The debt between them was too vast, too profound for words. Instead, they built a new routine around quiet companionship. Clara taught Emma how to use a smartphone, a device that had evolved in her absence and now felt like a piece of alien technology. Together, they navigated online banking, where Emma watched with a detached fascination as the settlements from frozen accounts and civil suits materialized as staggering numbers on a screen. The wealth was abstract, a numerical representation of a battle won. She felt no joy in it, only a cold sense of reparation. Her first independent purchase was not a car or jewelry, but a high-quality lock for the apartment door, one she controlled, with a key she kept on a chain around her neck, its metal resting against her skin, a constant, comforting weight. Her lawyers, a sharp, compassionate team funded by the very assets they were recovering, became her guides through the legal aftermath. They met in secure offices, their conversations a clinical dissection of Daniel's crumbling world. Emma learned of the cascading consequences, his business partners turning state's evidence, the unraveling of the offshore trusts Margaret had helped administer, the additional charges of fraud, tax evasion, and perjury that were stacking up like bricks around him. Margaret herself, haughty and defiant to the end, had been charged with conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Her fall from genteel society was, according to the lead attorney, spectacularly ugly. Lydia, it turned out, had been a junior associate at one of Daniel's shell companies. She had cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for immunity, providing a trove of emails and financial records that painted Daniel not as a shrewd businessman, but as a desperate, cornered fraud. The narrative in the media subtly shifted. The initial stories of white-collar crime began to include phrases like imprisoned wife, coercive control, and gothic horror in the suburbs. Emma refused every request for an interview, every offer for a book deal or a television movie. Her silence became a powerful part of the story, the invisible woman whose testimony was bringing down a monster. Yet, invisibility was a double-edged sword. In the safe, bland apartment, the adrenaline that had sustained her for 2 years began to ebb, leaving behind a deep, hollowed-out fatigue and a quiet, persistent rage. It wasn't the hot, screaming rage of the early days in the basement. It was a cold, tectonic plates shifting fury that simmered in her core. She was angry at Daniel, of course, but also at Margaret, at the society that had seen his polish and called it character, at the walls of the house that had held her screams, and at herself for the girl she had been, so eager to please, so quick to accept the slow narrowing of her world. Clara watched this new phase with a knowing eye. One afternoon, as Emma listlessly stirred a cup of tea, staring at nothing, Clara placed a brochure on the table. It was for a trauma therapy center, one that specialized in complex PTSD and situations of prolonged captivity. "It's not a sign of weakness," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "It's the next part of the fight for you." The therapy was brutal. Unpacking the 2 years in the basement, session by agonizing session, felt like performing surgery on her own soul without anesthetic. She worked with a therapist named Dr. Anya Voss, a woman with calm eyes and a voice that never wavered. They didn't just talk about the imprisonment, they deconstructed the marriage that led to it, the financial control dressed as responsibility, the isolation disguised as protectiveness, the constant subtle undermining that had eroded her sense of self long before the basement door closed. Emma learned words like gaslighting, financial abuse, and institutional betrayal. She learned that her body, still startlingly thin and marked by the physical deprivations, held the memory of the trauma in its very cells. She had panic attacks in grocery stores, overwhelmed by the choices and the crowds. The smell of certain cleaning products, the ones Daniel had favored, could send her reeling back to the sterile, oppressive air of the house. Dr. Voss gave her tools: breathing techniques, grounding exercises, a journal where she could pour out the unspeakable. Slowly, painstakingly, Emma began to rebuild a self from the wreckage. She was not reassembling the woman she had been. That woman was gone. She was building someone new, someone forged in darkness, tempered by survival, and fiercely protective of her own sovereignty. Parallel to this internal reconstruction, the external world of her new wealth demanded attention. Her financial advisor, a no-nonsense woman named Sophia, treated Emma's portfolio with a blend of professional rigor and palpable awe. The sums were significant, a mix of liquidated assets, court-ordered restitution, and a substantial whistleblower award from the Financial Crimes Task Force. The goal, Sophia said, spreading charts across a table, isn't just preservation, it's purposeful use. This money represents a profound injustice corrected. We can make it work for you and for others. This idea resonated deeply with Emma. The money felt tainted, stained with the memory of Daniel's greed and her own suffering. To hoard it would feel like a continuation of his pathology. With Clara and Sophia's guidance, she began to craft a philanthropic strategy. She established a foundation with a deliberately vague name, the Aurora Trust. Its purpose to fund shelters, legal aid, and advocacy programs for victims of domestic violence and coercive control, with a special focus on cases involving financial abuse and complex captivity. She funded Clara's dream of opening a small, secure, safe house in a rural location, a place with gardens and sunlight and no basements. She anonymously paid off the medical debts of the families of other women who had testified against Daniel's co-conspirators. The money, once a tool of control, was transformed into an instrument of liberation, not just her own, but for countless unseen others. 6 months after her release, the criminal trial of Daniel and Margaret began. Emma testified via closed-circuit television from a secure room in the courthouse, her image and voice transmitted, but her physical presence withheld. She had fought for this concession, and her legal team had secured it. She could not bear the thought of being in the same room with him, of feeling his gaze upon her again. From her sterile, quiet booth, she answered the prosecutor's questions with a chilling, flat calm. She described the temperature of the basement floor, the sound of the lock, the taste of the bread, the way the light from the bulb never changed. She detailed the financial controls, the isolation, the systematic erasure. She did not cry. Her detachment was more powerful than any tears. The defense attorney, a slick man who had tried to paint Daniel as the victim of a scheming, unstable woman, floundered before her placid, factual recounting. He couldn't rattle her. When he insinuated she had planned the whole thing for financial gain, she simply looked at the camera and said, "No one plans for 2 years of hunger in the dark for any amount of money. You plan for a vacation or a new car. You endure that for one reason only, to live to see the person who put you there held accountable." The jury's faces, on her monitor, were stone.
Daniel took the stand in his own defense. The man who had once dominated every room with his quiet, assured presence was diminished, his suit hanging slightly loose, his hair tinged with new gray. He stuck to his narrative. Emma was emotionally fragile. She had stolen from him. She had left. Her claims were the vengeful fabrications of a scorned woman. But under cross-examination, the facade crumbled. He couldn't explain the forensic evidence, the lack of her fingerprints on any travel documents, the complete absence of digital footprints after her alleged departure, the testimony of a security expert who detailed the sophistication of the home's alarm system, which had never registered an exit from any door or window on the night she supposedly fled. He grew agitated, then angry, then sullen. The final blow came when the prosecutor presented evidence Emma had helped compile. Bank records showing he had withdrawn the $100 himself the morning of the accusation from an ATM 3 blocks from his office. It had never been in the desk at all. It was the manufactured pretext, the first domino. Daniel's jaw worked soundlessly. The illusion of the respectable man was gone, replaced by the petulant, cornered boy who had never expected to be caught. The verdicts were swift. Daniel Carter was found guilty on all counts: false imprisonment, aggravated assault, multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and perjury. Margaret Carter was convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The sentencing hearing was where Emma chose to make her only public statement. She did not attend in person, but submitted a victim impact statement to be read aloud by the prosecutor. It was not a diatribe of hate. It was a cool, precise accounting of loss. She wrote of the loss of 2 years of her life, of the loss of trust in the world, of the loss of the ability to hear a door close with a spipe of fear. She wrote of the ongoing cost, the therapy, the nightmares, the permanent scar on her psyche. She concluded with a simple, devastating sentence. He did not just steal my time, he attempted to murder my future. The fact that I am building a new one is not his mercy, but my victory. When the judge pronounced Daniel's sentence, a term of decades that would ensure he would be an old man if he lived upon release, Emma, watching the news feed in her apartment, felt nothing at first. Then a deep, quiet tremor went through her, a seismic release of a tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. It was not happiness, it was finality. In the year that followed, Emma slowly emerged from her protective cocoon. She moved from the safe house to a light-filled loft in a different city, a space she decorated slowly, piece by piece, learning her own tastes from scratch. She bought art that was bold and colorful, furniture that was soft and inviting, nothing like the cold, perfect pieces Daniel had favored. She adopted a dog from a shelter, a large, shaggy mutt with anxious eyes that mirrored her own. They learned to trust the world together on long, meandering walks. She began taking classes, not for a degree, but for joy. A pottery class where she learned to center clay on the wheel, her hands finally creating instead of clinging. A literature course where she discovered a love for post-colonial novels, stories of resilience and identity. She started writing, not her story, but poetry, fragmented, sharp verses about light and stone and silence. Clara became the director of the safe house Emma funded, a place named Havenwood. Emma visited occasionally, never as a benefactor, but as a quiet guest who would help in the garden or read to children. She and Clara shared a bond that needed few words. They were sisters forged in a secret war. Emma's foundation, the Aurora Trust, grew, its anonymous donations seeding change in legislation and funding groundbreaking research into economic abuse. She worked through it all with a driven focus, channeling the strategic patience she had learned in the basement into building something lasting and good.
One autumn evening, 3 years after the basement door had closed, Emma stood on the balcony of her loft. The city lights twinkled below, a galaxy of human lives. The dog slept at her feet. A soft breeze carried the scent of distant rain. She wore the key to her front door around her neck, but she rarely thought about it now. The lock was just a lock. Inside, on her desk, lay a draft of a manuscript. It was not a memoir, it was a work of fiction, a psychological thriller about a woman who uses her invisibility as a weapon. Her agent was ecstatic about it. Emma took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cool, free air. The past was a country she had escaped, its borders closed. The memories were still there, shadows in a corner of her mind, but they no longer controlled the light. She thought of Daniel in his cell and felt a distant, almost scientific pity. He had tried to reduce her to nothing, a ghost in his basement. In doing so, he had unwittingly given her everything, a fierce clarity, a profound strength, and a purpose that burned brighter than any bare bulb in the dark. She was not just surviving. She was living, fully, deeply, and on her own terms. The woman who had been erased was now indelible, her story written not in scratches on a wall, but in the lives she helped rebuild, and the future she was courageously shaping, one peaceful breath at a time. The night stretched before her, vast and full of possibility, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Emma Carter was not afraid of the dark. The peace was not a steady state, but a tide, ebbing and flowing. There were days when the phantom chill of the basement floor would rise through the soles of her feet as she walked across her sun-warmed hardwood, or when the sound of a particular key turning in a neighboring door would freeze her mid-sentence, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. But the tools Dr. Voss had given her, the grounding exercises, the mantras, the understanding that her nervous system was a loyal soldier still standing guard, allowed her to weather these moments. She would press her palm flat against the cool glass of a window, name 5 things she could see, 4 she could touch, and remind herself, this is now, that was then. The door is open. Her novel, The Unseen Architect, became an unexpected sanctuary. In crafting the story of Alara, a woman who fakes her own death to meticulously dismantle her tycoon husband's empire from within, Emma found a strange catharsis. She could explore the darkest corners of strategy and revenge, the psychological complexity of playing dead while being fiercely alive, all through the safe veil of fiction. Writing was an act of reclamation, a way to orchestrate a narrative where the victim held all the power, where every detail served the final, satisfying collapse. Her agent, a fiercely energetic woman named Lena, declared it a masterpiece of suspense. "It's so visceral," Lena gushed over video call. "The details, the taste of stale air, the way sound carries in an empty house, it's chillingly authentic." Emma merely smiled, a private, knowing curve of her lips. The book sold at auction for a sum that made even Sophia raise an eyebrow, and the press, still fascinated by the enigmatic woman behind the Carter scandal, buzzed with speculation about the pseudonymous author, S.E. Vance. She gave no interviews, released no author photo. The mystery only fueled the fire. It was through the Foundation's work that she met Leo. The Aurora Trust was funding a pilot program for a new software tool designed to help financial advisors and lawyers identify hidden patterns of economic abuse in their clients' situations. Leo was the lead developer, a man in his late 40s with kind, tired eyes and a quiet intensity that spoke more of focus than fury. He presented the software to the board's board with a humble clarity, devoid of the slick salesmanship she had come to despise. He spoke of the code not as a product, but as a language that could translate hidden suffering into visible data. He explained that most of these patterns are invisible by design. We're trying to build a lens. Emma, attending remotely as the board's silent chair, found herself captivated by his mind. After the meeting, she instructed Sophia to approve the full grant request and, on an impulse she didn't fully analyze, asked if Mr. Thorne would be available for a follow-up discussion about potential applications. Their first conversation was strictly professional, a deep dive into algorithms and ethical data privacy walls.
The second drifted into philosophy, the nature of control, the architecture of freedom. He was divorced, he mentioned offhandedly, his own marriage having ended in a quiet, sorrowful unraveling rather than a dramatic explosion. He had no children. He lived with an elderly, half-blind Labrador. He asked her nothing personal, but his listening had a quality of deep, patient absorption that felt like a safe harbor. Their relationship evolved with a slowness that felt medicinal. It began as emails about code and charity, progressed to weekly video calls that lasted long after the business was concluded, and finally, after 6 months, to a cautious agreement to meet in person at a public botanical garden. Emma's anxiety that day was a live wire. Clara, now more friend than protector, helped her pick her clothes, nothing that reminded her of her old life, and drove her there, waiting in the cafe with a book while Emma walked the fern-lined paths. Leo was already there, studying a placard about tropical mosses. He looked up, and his smile was not one of greeting a benefactor or a mysterious survivor, but of simply recognizing a person he was glad to see. They walked for hours. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't fill silences with nervous chatter. When a sudden downpour sent visitors scrambling for cover, he simply opened his large, unfashionable umbrella and held it over both of them as they made their way to the greenhouse, his shoulder a careful, non-intrusive inch from hers. The smell of wet earth and blooming orchids, the drum of rain on glass, the solid, quiet presence of a man who asked for nothing. It felt like a baptism.
Trust, for Emma, was no longer an instinct, but a conscious, deliberate architecture. With Leo, she built it brick by brick. She told him about S.E. Vance before her publisher did. She confessed, in stages, fragments of her past. Not the graphic horror of the basement, but the broader landscape of loss and recovery. She called it a previous marriage that was very damaging. He never pressed. He simply absorbed the information and adjusted his behavior with a gentle, breathtaking precision. He always texted before coming over, even after she'd given him a key. He never commented on her finances, her security system, or the days when she was quiet and withdrawn. He talked to her dog in a silly voice that made her laugh. He cooked elaborate meals in her kitchen, leaving it spotless afterward. He was, in every sense, the antithesis of Daniel, present without being possessive, kind without being condescending, strong without needing to dominate. It was this growing sense of safety that made the intrusion so profoundly violating. It started subtly. A book on her shelf would be slightly out of place. A file on her encrypted computer would be open that she was sure she'd closed. A faint, unfamiliar scent, something metallic and clean like a hospital corridor, lingered in her foyer one afternoon. She blamed her own hypervigilance, the paranoia that Dr. Voss said was a normal echo of trauma. But the dog, Moose, began acting strangely, growling at a seemingly empty corner of the living room, refusing to go into her study. Then the emails arrived, not to her public address, but to the highly secure, encrypted account she used only for foundation business and correspondence with her legal team. The subject line was always a date. The body was empty except for a single, high-resolution photograph. The first was of her old house, the one with the basement. It was taken at night, from the street, the windows dark. The second was of Daniel's mother, Margaret, being led into the courthouse for her appeal hearing, her head held high. The third was of Emma herself, leaving her therapist's office the previous week, caught in profile, unaware. A cold, familiar dread, thicker than anything she'd felt in years, poured into her veins. This was not the press. This was not random. This was a message, a reminder. You are seen. You are not as safe as you think. She called her security consultant, a former federal agent named Grayson, who had been on retainer since the trial. He swept the loft. He found nothing. No cameras, no bugs. "Whoever this is, they're good," Grayson said, his face grim. "The photos are professional grade, taken from a distance with a serious lens. The access to that email, that's concerning. That's not amateur hour."
He upgraded her systems, implanted new firewalls, but the violation had already occurred. The sanctity of her new life had been breached. Emma's first instinct was to run, to vanish into a new identity with Clara. But the fury that rose to meet the fear was hotter and brighter. She had built too much, a life, a love, a purpose. She would not be terrorized back into a cage, real or psychological. This was a new kind of siege, and she would not endure it passively. She had become an architect of her own fate. She would now become a hunter in her own defense. She told Leo there was a security issue with the foundation, that she needed some space to handle it. He accepted it without question, though his eyes were full of worry. "Tell me what you need," he said simply. She needed him safe, so she asked for distance. With Grayson's help and a ruthless focus that felt like slipping back into an old, familiar skin, she began to investigate. The digital trail was a ghost. The emails were routed through a dizzying array of proxy servers, dead-ending in countries with no data-sharing treaties. The photos yielded no EXIF data. They had been scrubbed clean. This was a professional. But professionals, Emma had learned, were driven by motives. Who would do this? A vengeful associate of Daniel's? A fanatic who believed Margaret was innocent? A mercenary hired by someone from the shadows of the old financial network? She ruled out Daniel himself. His prison communications were monitored, and his spirit, according to the occasional report Grayson obtained, was broken, consumed by bitter despair. The break came from an unexpected quarter. Clara. Visiting Havenwood, Emma mentioned the scent she'd noticed. Metallic, clean, institutional. Clara's face went pale. "Iodine," she whispered. "Margaret. She used to swear by it as a disinfectant. She'd wipe down every surface with it, said it was the only thing that killed unseen vermin." The memory was a lightning strike. Margaret, fastidious, controlling, fanatical about cleanliness. Margaret, who was out on bail pending her appeal, her assets largely seized, but her arrogance intact. Margaret, who had always seen Emma as the unseen vermin in her perfect son's life. It wasn't proof, but it was a direction. Emma and Grayson turned their focus on Margaret Carter. Her bail conditions restricted her to the county, but she was living in a modest rented condo paid for by a distant, elderly cousin. Surveillance showed a quiet, rigid existence. She went to church, to the grocery store, to her lawyer's office. But Grayson, digging deeper into financial forensics, found a curious anomaly. Small, regular payments were being made from an obscure trust fund, one that had somehow been overlooked in the asset seizures, to a private investigative firm based in another state, a firm with a reputation for discreet and sometimes borderline ethical work. The pieces clicked. Margaret wasn't just sitting in her condo fuming. She was spending the last of her hidden resources to have Emma watched, not to harm her physically, perhaps, but to haunt her, to unnerve her, to prove that the Carters had eyes, still had reach. It was a psychological warfare waged by a crumbling general, a final, pathetic attempt to exert control. The realization transformed her fear into a cold, focused contempt. Margaret wasn't a monster in the shadows. She was a desperate old woman trying to terrify her with pictures.
Emma's response was not legal, not yet. It was tactical. She instructed Grayson to use every resource to find the private investigator. When he was identified, a man named Royce, former military police with a gambling habit, Emma did not have him confronted. Instead, she had Grayson dig until he found Royce's pressure point. A teenage son from a failed marriage, a boy Royce adored and was putting through an expensive college, a boy with a promising future. Then Emma sent a message of her own. She had a package delivered to Royce's office. It contained two things. First, a detailed dossier on his son, his class schedule, his dorm address, his girlfriend's name. Nothing threatening, just a demonstration of profound visibility. Second, a USB drive containing a single file, a copy of the devastating financial audit that had doomed Margaret Carter, along with a note, "Your client's resources are finite. Mine are not. Your next payment from her is attached.
There will not be another. Choose your next photograph very, very carefully. The surveillance stopped. The emails ceased. A week later, Grayson confirmed that Royce had officially closed the case with Margaret, citing irreconcilable differences. When Margaret called him, furious, he was reported to have said only, "The subject is off limits. You're on your own." Emma knew it was over. Margaret, stripped of her last weapon, was now truly powerless. The appeal would fail, the legal machinery would grind on, but Emma was done being a subject, a victim, a target. She had faced down the ghost and found it was just a bitter old woman with a bottle of iodine. That evening, she invited Leo over. She cooked dinner for the first time in weeks. As they washed dishes side by side, the comfortable silence between them filled with the simple, solid sounds of running water and clinking plates. She put her wet hand on his arm. He stilled, looking at her. "The security issue," she said, her voice clear in the quiet kitchen, "it's resolved." He searched her face, saw the certainty there, the return of the peace he'd missed. He didn't ask for details. He simply nodded, dried his hands, and pulled her into a gentle, firm embrace. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The key around her neck pressed between them, a small, cool disk. Outside, the city lights glittered, indifferent and beautiful. The past had tried to send one last tendril into her present, and she had severed it with a surgeon's precision. She was no longer just surviving, or even just living. She was protecting her peace, and she was, at last, truly unassailable. The story of the woman in the basement was closed. The story of the woman who built a life from its ashes was just beginning, and it was hers alone to write. The confrontation with Margaret's ghost had an unexpected effect. It acted as a final purge, a cauterization of a wound that had stubbornly refused to fully close. The lingering sense of being watched, the subconscious flinch at unexpected sounds, these began to recede like a tide pulling back for good, leaving behind a firmer, more stable shore. Emma felt a shift within herself, a consolidation of power that was no longer about defense or strategy, but about a quiet, unshakable ownership of her own existence. She began to sleep through the night, the dreams of concrete and locks fading into a vague, distant archive. Moose, sensing the change, ceased his low growling at empty corners and spent his days in sprawling, sun-patched contentment. With Leo, a new layer of intimacy bloomed. Having seen a glimpse of the steel beneath her serenity, the focused, ruthless efficiency with which she had handled the threat, he seemed to understand her on a deeper level. He didn't shy away from it. He respected it. One evening, as they sat on her balcony sharing a bottle of wine, the city a tapestry of light below them, he spoke without looking at her. "You know, you never have to shield me from the parts of you that had to become hard to survive." The statement hung in the air, a gift of profound acceptance. Emma, who had spent so long compartmentalizing, the victim, the survivor, the benefactor, the lover, felt a wall within her dissolve. She didn't tell him everything that night, but she began to, in fragments, over the following months. She told him about the scratch of the nail on the basement wall, the taste of the secret apple, the sound of Clara's whisper through the door. He listened, his hand covering hers, his silence a sanctuary. In return, she learned about the quiet despair of his own failed marriage, the years of mutual erosion he called the Great Forgetting. They were two people who had learned in different crucibles the cost of a life unlived and were now determined to build something authentic, one careful, honest piece at a time. Her novel, The Unseen Architect, was published to a maelstrom of acclaim. The reviews called it a masterclass in suspense, a chillingly authentic portrayal of psychological warfare, and a triumph of the quiet, strategic mind. The speculation about the identity of S.E. Vance reached a fever pitch, with literary sleuths drawing inevitable and often outlandish parallels to the Emma Carter case. Lena, her agent, fielded endless requests. "They're begging for an interview," she said, her voice crackling with excitement over the phone. "Just one, a photo, something. The mystery is killing them." Emma remained unmoved. The mystery is the point. Let them have the book. That's enough. She attended the launch party incognito, a guest of Lena's, watching from a corner as people dissected her work, unaware the author stood 3 feet away sipping sparkling water. It was a power she relished, to be both central and invisible, to have her voice heard loudly while her person remained her own. The success of the book brought a new wave of financial independence, but more importantly, it amplified the reach of the Aurora Trust. Donations soared. Invitations to speak at conferences, albeit anonymously as a foundation representative, arrived. She accepted a select few, always behind a podium, always with her face subtly shadowed, her voice modulated. She spoke not of her own story, but of the data, the patterns, the urgent need for systemic change in how financial institutions and the legal system recognized economic entrapment. Her arguments were razor sharp, backed by the cold, hard numbers her foundation's research was now producing. She became a whispered legend in advocacy circles, the anonymous benefactor who understood the enemy's playbook because she had memorized it in the dark. It was at one such conference in Geneva, after delivering a keynote that received a standing ovation, that the past found her one last time, not as a threat, but as a summons. A woman approached her as she was leaving the stage, a woman in a severe, elegant suit, her bearing military straight. She introduced herself as Inspector Valérie Durand of the French Office Central de Répression de la Criminalité Financière. Madame Vance, Durand said in precise, lightly accented English, extending a hand. Emma, using her pseudonym publicly, shook it, her guard instantly up. A powerful speech. It resonates with a case that has lingered on my desk. Durand led her to a quiet alcove away from the crowd. She opened a slim tablet revealing not photographs, but complex webs of financial transactions, shell companies, and property deeds. We have been tracking a network for years, Durand explained, her finger tracing lines on the screen. It is sophisticated, layered through several European jurisdictions. The central node, we believed, was your late husband's associate, François Desmarais. Emma remembered the name, a charming, silver-haired Frenchman who had dined at their house, whose laughter had been too loud, his compliments too florid. Desmarais died 6 months ago, a sailing accident. Convenient. With him, we thought many threads were cut, but in his effects, we found something interesting. She zoomed in on a transaction log. A series of payments, stopped abruptly 2 years ago to a holding company that owned the security firm that installed the system in your former home, the one with the specialized basement door. Emma's blood ran cold, but her face remained a calm mask. What are you implying, Inspector? I imply nothing. I state a fact. The security modifications to that basement, the reinforced door, the soundproofing, the separate hidden electrical line, were not a standard renovation. They were a custom order paid for by Desmarais' network 18 months before your disappearance. Daniel Carter approved the work, but he did not pay for it. It was a gift. Durand's sharp eyes fixed at Emma. We believe it was a test case, a proof of concept for a service Desmarais offered to certain clients, the discreet, permanent management of problematic individuals. Your husband was not just a client, he was a junior partner. His arrogance in using the service on his own wife was his downfall, but it also gave us a crack. Your testimony and the financial trail you helped expose is the key that may finally unlock this entire network. Emma felt the world tilt. The basement had not just been Daniel's private obsession. It had been a project, a piece of a larger, more horrifying enterprise. Her imprisonment was a line item in a monstrous portfolio. The sheer, banal evil of it took her breath away. What do you need from me? she asked, her voice remarkably steady. Your memory, said Durand. Names, faces, conversations you overheard, anything Desmarais or his associates said in your home. Parties, meetings. You were an invisible woman in that house, yes? Now we need you to tell us what you saw and heard while unseen. It was a different kind of excavation. Emma spent the next week in a secure suite in a Geneva hotel, working with Durand and a forensic accountant. It was more exhausting than therapy, more draining than writing the novel. She dredged up fragments she had buried, snippets of conversations between Daniel and Desmarais about asset relocation and quieting liabilities. The memory of a weekend house party where a grim-faced Eastern European man had toured the house, complimenting the solid construction. The night Daniel had come home exhilarated, talking about new investment vehicles in the Balkans. She had been furniture then, part of the scenery, and they had spoken freely in front of her. Now, those forgotten scraps became coordinates on a map of a transnational crime syndicate specializing in financial fraud and the literal disappearance of people. When the work was done, Durand was visibly impressed. You have an exceptional memory for detail, madame. This is invaluable. As Emma prepared to leave, Durand stopped her. There is one more thing. This network, they are ruthless. They are now aware of your role in Carter's conviction. This new collaboration will not remain secret forever. You must be vigilant. Emma met the inspector's gaze. Inspector Durand, I have spent years building a life that cannot be terrorized. Let them be aware. I am not hiding anymore. The return flight home was a journey across a new internal landscape. The revelation was horrifying, yet it also provided a perverse sense of closure. Her suffering had not been a singular domestic tragedy, but a node in a vast web of criminality. By surviving, by testifying, by remembering, she had struck a blow against something far larger than Daniel. Her personal vengeance had become, inadvertently, a form of justice on a grander scale. She landed with a new resolve. The first thing she did was call a meeting with her entire team, Sophia, Grayson, the lead lawyer from the trust. She laid out the situation with Durand, the expanded threat profile. She said, we need to be prepared, not scared, her voice leaving no room for debate. She authorized Grayson to enhance her security to a level befitting a head of state, not out of fear, but as a logical, strategic upgrade. She restructured elements of the trust to be even more resilient, more opaque. Then she went to Leo. She told him everything, the full, unvarnished truth of the basement, the new revelations from Geneva, the potential ongoing risk. She gave him a choice, clear and unencumbered. This is my reality. It may always be. If this is too much, I will understand, completely. He listened, his face a landscape of shock, sorrow, and dawning awe. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he took both her hands in his. Emma, he said, and the use of her real name, not her pseudonym, felt like an anchor. You are the most formidable person I have ever met. You walked out of hell and then turned around to help others find the way. You stared down a monster and then helped the police track its whole family. If there's risk, then we'll manage it. Together. I'm not going anywhere. It was the final surrender, the last wall gone. She wept then, not from sadness, but from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being fully known and fully chosen. Months flowed into a year. The investigation with Durand progressed, leading to a series of quiet, coordinated arrests across Europe. The headlines spoke of a major blow to a transnational fraud and trafficking ring. Emma's name was never mentioned. She was protected as a confidential source. Her life, meanwhile, deepened in its richness. She and Leo bought an old, rambling house in the countryside, a place with a sprawling garden and a library, and no basement. They married in a small, simple ceremony in that garden, with Clara as the maid of honor and Moose as the ring bearer, a wreath of flowers clumsily attached to his collar. Emma wrote a second novel, this time under her own name, Emma Carter Thorne. It was not a thriller, but a quiet, powerful story about a botanist who discovers a rare flower growing in the polluted soil of an industrial wasteland. It was about resilience, about finding beauty in broken places, about the slow, patient work of regeneration. Critics called it a stunning departure, deeply moving, and a testament to the human spirit. She gave a single televised interview to promote it. She spoke of recovery, of art, of love. She spoke of the work of the Aurora Trust. She did not speak of basements. She didn't need to. Her presence, calm, radiant, rooted in hard-won peace, said it all. One afternoon, she sat in her garden, the manuscript of a third book, a hybrid of memoir and philosophical reflection on invisibility and power, open on her lap. Leo was tinkering with a beehive at the far end of the property. Clara was coming for dinner later. The late sun gilded the leaves. A letter had arrived that morning, forwarded by her lawyer. It was from Daniel, a rambling, self-pitying screed from prison, pleading for forgiveness, claiming he was a changed man, ruined by her betrayal. She had read it once, felt nothing but a distant pity, and then methodically fed it into the shredder. He was a ghost from a past that no longer had any claim on her. She watched a ladybug climb a blade of grass, its journey deliberate and unconcerned. She thought of the girl she had been, the woman in the dark, the survivor, the writer, the wife. She was all of them, a tapestry woven from threads of terror, patience, rage, and love. The story of the stolen $100 and the locked door was a closed chapter, its villain defeated, its victim transcended. The story now was of sunlight and bees and the profound, everyday miracle of a door left open to the breeze. Emma Carter Thorne closed her eyes, tilted her face to the sun, and smiled. The silence around her was no longer empty, it was full, deep, and completely her own. She was, finally and forever, home.